The student who understood first. Part 1. The student who didn't ask questions. Her name was Elena Martinez, and she had been training at the dojo for 3 weeks when Chuck realized she understood something he hadn't yet taught. She was 24 years old, a graduate student in mathematics at UCLA, with the specific quality of attention that mathematicians bring to problems: patient, methodical, willing to sit with complexity until it resolves into pattern. She had enrolled in the beginner class without prior martial arts experience, which meant she was starting from zero, no preconceptions, no habits to unlearn, just the clean slate that beginners occasionally brought. What made her unusual was not her technical execution. She was adequate but not exceptional, making the normal errors that beginners make, learning at the normal pace. We have many more stories to tell and countless doors to unlock. Empower us with your likes, take your place by subscribing, and be the first to share in every new secret by turning on notifications. What made her unusual was the quality of her attention between techniques. Most beginners, when not actively executing a movement, relaxed their attention, looked around the room, checked their positioning in the mirror, waited for the next instruction. Elena did none of these things. Between techniques, she stood still with her eyes closed, appearing to be processing something internal. Chuck noticed this in the second week. In the third week, he asked her about it. After class ended and the other students had left, he approached her. "Can I ask what you're doing?" he said. "Between techniques, when your eyes are closed." Elena looked at him with the directness that was characteristic of her manner. "I'm feeling the residue," she said. "The residue," Chuck said. "After I execute a technique," Elena said, "there's a quality that remains in my body for a few seconds, a specific feeling of what just happened. I'm trying to notice that feeling before it fades, to remember what it feels like when the technique is done correctly versus when it's done incorrectly." Chuck looked at her for a long moment. What she had just described was the internal feedback mechanism that serious practitioners developed after years of training, the capacity to distinguish, through proprioceptive awareness, between correct and incorrect execution without external correction. Most students took 3 to 5 years to develop this capacity. Elena was developing it in 3 weeks. "Has anyone taught you to do that?" Chuck said. "No," Elena said. "It just seemed like the useful thing to notice." Saying Fudri Nastia. Part 2. What Elena noticed. Over the following months, Chuck paid closer attention to Elena's progression. She advanced technically at a normal pace, learning the basic stances, the fundamental strikes, the simple combinations that constituted the beginner curriculum. Nothing exceptional, but the quality of her engagement with the practice was different from other students at her level. Most beginners approached training as information acquisition. Chuck demonstrates a technique, they copy the technique, they practice until the copying is accurate, they move to the next technique. Elena approached it differently. She treated each technique as a question rather than an answer. The question was, what is this technique trying to teach me about how my body works? Chuck saw this in the way she practiced. After learning a new punch, she would spend time varying the execution, changing the hip rotation slightly, adjusting the shoulder position, testing different breathing patterns, and observing what each variation produced in terms of power, balance, and efficiency. She was conducting experiments, using her own body as the laboratory. In her 4th month, during a session on front kicks, Elena stayed after class and asked Chuck a question. "When you demonstrate the front kick," she said, "there's a moment right before the extension where something happens in your hip, a kind of settling. I can see it, but I can't feel it when I do the kick myself. What is that?" Chuck demonstrated the kick slowly. He felt for the moment Elena was describing, the instant before the leg extended, when the supporting hip rotated and settled into position, creating the stable base that allowed the kicking leg to generate power without losing balance. "It's the weight transfer," Chuck said. The supporting leg accepts the full weight of the body, and the hip adjusts to accommodate the shift. That settling is the hip finding the position that allows maximum stability. How do I learn to feel that? Elena said. Repetition, Chuck said. 1,000 kicks, 10,000. Eventually, the proprioceptive awareness develops and you'll feel it without thinking about it. Elena nodded. Then she said something that changed how Chuck thought about teaching. But if I'm doing 1,000 kicks without feeling the thing I'm trying to learn, she said, am I actually learning it? Or am I just reinforcing the execution without the awareness? Chuck looked at her. The question was sophisticated. More sophisticated than most intermediate students could formulate, let alone beginners 4 months into training. What do you think? He said. I think, Elena said slowly, that repetition without awareness builds habit, and habit without awareness is just automatic execution. But the practice is supposed to build awareness, not just habit. Yes, Chuck said, that's exactly right. Omaman no Lazarada. Part 3. The conversation Chuck hadn't expected. The following week, Chuck restructured the beginner curriculum, not dramatically, not in ways that would be obvious to most students, but he added something that had been implicit in his own practice, but not explicit in his teaching. The instruction to notice, not just to execute techniques correctly, but to notice the internal experience of executing them, to feel the weight transfer, the muscle engagement, the breath coordination, to develop the proprioceptive awareness that separated mechanical repetition from genuine learning. Elena had shown him that this awareness could be taught directly rather than waiting for it to emerge after years of practice, that students who were told what to notice could develop the noticing faster than students who were left to discover it themselves. After adding this instruction to the curriculum, Chuck saw changes in other students, not all of them. Some students weren't interested in internal awareness and were content with mechanical proficiency, but the ones who were interested developed faster. Their technique improved more quickly because they were learning to self-correct based on internal feedback rather than waiting for external correction. In her 8th month, Elena earned her yellow belt, the first rank promotion typically achieved after 6 to 9 months of training. At the promotion ceremony, Chuck asked her to demonstrate the front kick. She executed it with the technical precision that yellow belt required. But more than that, Chuck could see the awareness in the execution, the deliberate weight transfer, the conscious hip settling, the specific quality of attention that indicated she was feeling the technique rather than just performing it. After the ceremony, she came to his office. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Always. You changed how you teach," Elena said. "After our conversation about the front kick, you started telling students to notice the internal experience. Did I cause that change?" Chuck looked at her. The question was direct in a way that most students wouldn't venture, asking whether their influence had affected the teaching. "Yes," he said, "you caused it." "How?" Elena said. "You showed me," Chuck said, "that the awareness I developed after years of practice can be taught directly to beginners, that instead of waiting for students to discover the internal experience themselves, I can point them toward it from the beginning. You discovered it yourself in 3 weeks. That told me it's teachable." Elena was quiet for a moment. "But I'm just doing what seemed obvious," she said, "noticing what's happening internally. Isn't that what everyone does?" "No," Chuck said. "Most students don't do that. Most students focus on external execution, making the technique look correct. The internal experience develops later, if it develops at all. You started with the internal experience and let the external execution follow from that. That's unusual." "Why?" Elena said. "Because," Chuck said, "most people are trained from childhood to pay attention to external appearance rather than internal experience, to focus on how things look rather than how things feel. The practice reverses that. but the reversal usually takes years. You did it immediately. Because I'm a mathematician, Elena said. Chuck looked at her. Explain. Mathematics, Elena said, is entirely internal. The objects we work with don't exist in the physical world. They exist in abstract space. To do mathematics, you have to develop the capacity to work with things that have no external form, to feel your way through logical structures that have no visual representation. She paused. When I started training here, I applied the same approach. I treated techniques as abstract objects that I needed to feel my way through, rather than visual patterns I needed to copy. Chuck sat back in his chair. What Elena had just described was the connection he had been trying to articulate for years, the relationship between internal awareness and effective practice. She had given him the language for it. That's the practice, he said, what you just described. The capacity to work with internal experience rather than external appearance. Most students take years to develop that capacity. You brought it with you. Part 4. What Elena taught the class. In her second year, Elena became an assistant instructor. This was unusual. Most assistant instructors had 3 to 4 years of training before taking on teaching responsibilities. But Chuck recognized that Elena's capacity to articulate the internal experience of techniques made her valuable in a teaching role, particularly for students who were struggling with the conceptual understanding that separated mechanical execution from genuine practice. He assigned her to work with the advanced beginners, students who had been training for 6 to 12 months and who were at the stage where technical proficiency needed to deepen into awareness. Elena taught them the way she had learned, by directing attention to internal experience. Instead of saying, execute the punch this way, she would say, notice what happens in your shoulder when you rotate your hip. Instead of correcting external form, she would ask, what did that feel like? Did you feel the power generate from your center or from your arm? The students responded, not all of them. Some found the internal focus confusing or irrelevant. But the ones who engaged with it developed faster. Their technique became more efficient because they were learning to feel inefficiency rather than just seeing it. Chuck watched this from the edge of the mat. He saw Elena doing what he had been trying to do for years, teaching the awareness directly rather than waiting for it to emerge through repetition. She was better at it than he was, not because she understood the practice more deeply. She was still in her second year, still developing her own capacity. But because she had the language for it, the mathematical training had given her a vocabulary for describing internal experience that martial arts culture didn't typically provide. After one session where Elena had worked with a student on weight transfer awareness, Chuck approached her. You're teaching them faster than I was teaching them, he said. Elena looked at him. Is that a problem? No, Chuck said. It's what I wanted. I just didn't know how to do it until you showed me. I'm only doing what you taught me, Elena said. No, Chuck said. I taught you the techniques. You taught yourself the awareness. And now you're teaching the awareness to others. That's different. Elena was quiet for a moment. Do you think, she said, that the awareness is more important than the techniques? Chuck thought about this. It was a question he had been asking himself for years without arriving at a definitive answer. I think, he said, that the techniques without awareness are just movement, and the awareness without techniques has nothing to operate on. You need both. But if I had to choose which one to prioritize in teaching, I would choose awareness, because students who develop awareness will correct their own techniques. Students who only develop techniques will plateau. That's what I've been noticing, Elena said. The students who focus on feeling the techniques improve faster than the students who focus on performing them correctly. Yes, Chuck said. You noticed that in your first month. It took me 10 years to notice it. Mentally nodes nager. Part 5. The question Elena asked in her third year. Elena trained at the dojo for 4 years total. In her third year, she earned her brown belt, one rank below black, the stage where technical proficiency was assumed and the practice became more about refinement than acquisition. She continued teaching the advanced beginner classes, continued developing the methods for directing students' attention to internal experience, continued demonstrating that awareness could be taught directly rather than waiting for it to emerge. In the spring of her fourth year, she came to Chuck's office with a question. "I've been thinking about something," she said, "about why I understood the practice quickly, why the internal awareness came naturally to me." "Tell me," Chuck said. "I think," Elena said, "it's because mathematics prepared me for exactly this kind of work. Mathematics trains you to work with abstractions, to manipulate objects that don't exist physically, to feel your way through logical structures using only internal experience." She paused. "The practice is the same. You're working with internal experience, proprioception, balance, breath, intention, and learning to manipulate it precisely. It's abstract work. Most people aren't trained to do abstract work. I was." Chuck nodded. "I think you're right. But here's what I've been wondering," Elena said. "If mathematical training prepared me for this practice, what does this practice prepare people for? What's the abstract work that martial arts training enables?" Chuck looked at her. The question was the kind that opened rather than closed. It didn't have a single answer, but pointed toward a territory that required exploration. "I don't know," he said. "What do you think?" "I think," Elena said slowly, "that the practice trains you to work with your own internal state as a manipulable object. Most people experience their internal state as something that happens to them. Fear happens, anger happens, fatigue happens. They're passive recipients of their own experience." She paused. "The practice teaches you that internal state is not something that happens to you. It's something you can work with, adjust, modify, control." Chuck was quiet for a long moment. What Elena had just articulated was something he had been living for 20 years without fully articulating. The practice had taught him exactly what she described, that internal state was not fixed, that fear could be managed, that fatigue could be worked through, that the relationship between internal experience and external action could be modified through deliberate practice. "That's it," he said. "That's what the practice prepares you for, the capacity to work with your own internal experience as a modifiable system rather than as a fixed condition. And that's what makes serious practitioners different," Elena said. "Not the techniques. The techniques are just the method. What makes them different is that they've learned to operate their own nervous system more precisely than most people." Chuck looked at her. "How long have you been thinking about this?" 6 months, Elena said. "Since I earned brown belt and realized that the technical learning was mostly complete and what remained was refinement. I wanted to understand what refinement was actually refining. And refinement," Elena said, "is learning to operate your internal experience with increasing precision. The techniques are stable. What's being refined is the quality of awareness you bring to the techniques, the capacity to notice smaller and smaller details of internal experience and adjust them deliberately." Chuck sat back in his chair. Elena had just described, in mathematical language, what he had been teaching for 20 years using martial arts language. The two languages were pointing at the same thing. "You should write this down," he said. "I have," Elena said. "It's part of my dissertation." Chuck looked at her. "Your dissertation?" "Yes," Elena said. "I'm writing about the mathematics of embodied awareness, using martial arts training as the case study. The practice has given me the experiential foundation for understanding how abstract systems can be mapped onto physical experience." Chuck was quiet. Elena was doing what serious practitioners eventually did, taking what the practice had taught them and applying it to their primary domain. For her, that domain was mathematics. The practice had given her something that would change how she did mathematics, and mathematics had given her something that was changing how martial arts were taught. "When you finish," Chuck said, I want to read it. You will, Elena said. Isimulation de sonus both APILOG. What Chuck learned. Elena left the dojo in her 5th year, not because she stopped practicing. She continued training, she told Chuck, but at a different school closer to her new position at MIT, where she had accepted a postdoctoral fellowship in applied mathematics. Before she left, she gave Chuck a copy of her dissertation, 300 pages of mathematical notation and philosophical analysis, using martial arts training as the empirical foundation for a theory of embodied cognition. Chuck read it over the course of a month. He understood perhaps 30% of the mathematics and 90% of the philosophy. What he understood clearly was that Elena had done something unprecedented. She had brought mathematical rigor to the description of internal awareness that martial arts practitioners developed, but rarely articulated clearly. She had understood the practice first, not just before other students. Before Chuck himself had fully understood what he was teaching, she had brought mathematical awareness to the practice and had found that the practice was doing what mathematics did, training the capacity to work with abstractions, to manipulate internal experience deliberately, to operate systems that existed only in conscious attention. And she had given Chuck the language to teach what he had been teaching, the language of internal experience as modifiable system, the language of awareness as the primary curriculum, the language that made explicit what had been implicit in his teaching for 20 years. Chuck kept her dissertation on the shelf in his office. He referenced it when training advanced students. He used her language when explaining what the practice was for. Elena had understood first, and in understanding first, she had taught Chuck what he had been teaching all along without fully knowing it. That was how teaching worked. The student who understood most deeply taught the teacher what the teaching meant. The practice continued, informed now by the clarity Elena had brought to it. Chuck taught, students learned, some understood quickly, others took years, but all of them, if they stayed long enough, eventually discovered what Elena had discovered in 3 weeks, that the practice was teaching them to work with their own internal experience as a deliberate, modifiable, precisely controllable system. That was the practice. That was what it had always been. Elena had simply been the first to name it clearly. We have many more stories to tell and countless doors to unlock. Empower us with your likes, take your place by subscribing, and be the first to share in every new secret by turning on notifications.